Welcome to our webinar today, this evening, depending where you are. This webinar is part of our knowledge engagement series of the Comparative Civilizations Forum. And today we have an exceptional guest, Stephen Satkiewicz. So we were just before discussing about pronunciation of surnames. But I'll leave that then to Stephen to talk more about on that topic. Stephen will, I think, best introduce himself. I didn't introduce myself. I am Bibi Pelic, the president of the Comparative Civilizations Forum. And well, thank you for tuning in. And I think, Stephen, we can begin. Just one thing, our format this today is that approximately 60 minutes, Stephen will deliver his presentation, and then we'll have then a half an hour approximately for a Q&A. So
Very good. And you did perfect pronouncing my name. I've heard some other pronunciations in my day, and that's a thing a lot of Polish Americans deal with. So I am a board member of the Comparative Civilizations Forum. I am also the current book review editor for our flagship journal, peer review journal, Comparative Civilizations Review. And the story behind this presentation is both kind of a little bit of my own life story, but also it was kind of inspired a bit by our 2023 conference in Warsaw. So, as you can tell, I have a Polish name. I grew up in a Polish American family and grew up in an area that had a sizable Polish American community. So it was very interesting trying to go to Poland, a country that, in some ways, when you grow up in a diaspora context, you kind of grow up in the shadow of another country. So then you get to go over there and and it was just so amazing. Like I could recognize so much. And of course there are differences between the diaspora and Poland. And the term I'm going to use, the term that's used for the Polish diaspora is Polonia. So there's Poland and then there's Polonia. Polonia is technically the Latin term for Poland, but it's used for the diaspora. And not only that, a lot of the people that I met in Poland, they could recognize that I had a Polish name and they were very interested to know more about the diaspora. Like how did, what are Polish Americans like? Like what is their sense of being Polish and everything? And it was a good opportunity for me to kind of spread the story of our community. And I honestly got the impression like I was a long lost cousin being welcomed back into the family. And in some ways, that's probably a good way to think about the diaspora and what we usually call in English the old country. You know, we're cousins, which at least still establishes there's a connection, but also we don't have to fight over like, well, who's more authentically Polish or not? Because really, as I'm going to hopefully explain, we kept a lot of our traditions, but it also uh, embraced a lot of aspects of American culture, and the fusion of those two created a very unique twist to the Polish identity. So I do have a presentation, and the picture I have here is a picture I have. It's the Polish American mural at St. Heinous Church here in Detroit. And I think it's really interesting because when you look at it, it kind of explains a little bit of like what it means to be Polish America or in the diaspora, because you have both the Polish eagle and the American eagle. So they're both symbols of their countries, but they're kind of stacked on top of each other. So it's not necessarily a question of either or, but how do the two kind of relate to one another? And that's always kind of a question. And especially in Poland, this issue was constantly in my mind, and especially with the jet lag, I had plenty of time to think about that type of issue. And then here we are. So, first off, I'd like to share a little bit of my Polish credentials, if you will. And this is a very prized possession, heirloom that I was able to inherit from my grandmother. It's a commemorative plaque for my grandfather, Eugeniusz, or Eugene as he was often known in English, Satkiewicz. And this is a commemorative plaque for his first communion that he took on June 3rd, 1928. And there's a little bit of a story of how I was able to obtain this, but again, it's a very special object, heirloom for us. And I think also if you look at it, there's just so many different layers of this. I've seen other examples of this from this time period where other children, uh, Polish American children, would receive similar commemorative plaques like this of their first communion. So this was a common practice at the time for Polish Americans. And of course, many Polish Americans, the vast majority of them were Catholic. So a lot of rituals, a lot of rites of the Catholic faith also had a lot of very important social and cultural significance to the Polish American community, which also reflected back the culture back in Poland. And this is a close up of the writing. So, of course, it's a remembrance of the first communion of Eugene Satkiewicz. He took it at St. Władysław or Ladislav, which was a major Polish American church in the Detroit area. It recently closed, but we're still trying to preserve it as at least a museum. June 3rd, 1928. And then Majewski down here, I think that is the signature of the priest who officiated the first communion. That might be his signature. I don't know for certain, but I think again, it may look like a simple object, but hey, it incorporates not only a key element of my grandfather's life, encapsulates the history of my family, but it also very concretely encapsulate, the Polish community, especially at this time in America. And every time I've shown this to people, to Polish people, their jaws just drop and they're like, that is so beautiful. And even one nun I showed it to, she's like, wow, did your grandfather get that in Poland? And I said, no, he got it here in America. But she was just so deeply touched and impressed. And of course, kind of a brief statistics about Polish Americans. There's roughly about 8 to 9 million of us, and that makes us about 3% of the total population. And the areas that they are mostly concentrated in are in the Northeast and the Midwest. Chicago, New York City, and Detroit, which is where I am from, they're kind of the largest areas. And the picture you see here is a picture I took. It's of the Polish Century Club that exists just north of Detroit, but again, kind of just shows that, hey, the Polish presence, and you see the Polish flag, the Polish eagle all over the place in a lot of areas of the Detroit area and other areas where Polish people settled in big numbers. This is also very special. This is a mural at the Hamtramck Historical Museum. Hamtramck is a city adjacent to Detroit, but it's also the area that the Polish Americans kind of settled in great numbers. So it's kind of the heart of the Polish community in the Detroit area. And I think this mural kind of represents and encapsulates that heritage, just like my earlier example from my grandfather kind of helps do that. You see, of course, them in traditional Polish folk dance dress. You see St. Florian Church in the background, which is a very prominent Polish American church. You see the Dodge factory representing how Polish Americans would have worked in the automobile industry at the beginning of the 20th century. You see Schrodex, Warsaw Bakery, some of the bakeries and a lot of the markets that exist, and Schrodex still exists in Hamtramck. And then you also see in the top left corner, you see Our Lady of Czestochowa, which is a very prominent Polish religious icon of the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus. And I believe she's even been officially declared the Queen of Poland, but she has a lot of religious and cultural significance. And also, you might not be able to see it, but right beneath her, that's also Pope John Paul II representing his visit to Detroit in 1987. We'll get into that in a minute. So, of course, I'll give a very brief overview history of Polish Americans. And of course, two very prominent Polish American figures are Thaddeus Kosciuszko and Kazimierz Puławski, who their significance was is that they came over during the American Revolution and they fought for American freedom. Pulaski helped create the American cavalry, and he died in service to America, which later allowed him to get U.S. citizenship. I think it was granted under President Obama during his presidency. But then Kosciuszko also did a lot of engineering. He also helped design West Point, which later became the Academy for the U.S. Army. But these two are usually often invoked a lot, and of course, it just shows a little bit of the devotion of Polish Americans to America and to American freedom. And it's just, hey, it goes all the way back to the very beginnings. Now, there are three main waves of Polish emigration to America, and depending on what wave you are from or descendant from, can also affect what is your conception of being Polish American. So there's not just one idea of being Polish American. It can differ from generation. It can also differ from location. I notice sometimes if I compare it to Detroit to say Chicago and other areas, there's again continuities and parallels, but also there's distinctions. Now, the first wave kind of occurred during the late 19th century and the early 20th century. A lot of these came from peasant and working class backgrounds, and they came mostly for economic purposes to try to make a living in America. Sometimes they make a living in America and they go back to Poland, but then for various reasons, sometimes they would stay. The second wave kind of came in wake of the Second World War and the beginnings of the Cold War. So after suffering under the Nazi occupation and then later the Soviet occupation of Poland, many Poles fled to America. They tended to have more of a political understanding of what it meant to be Polish American. And then in the 1980s, we started to see the rise of solidarity and a lot of opposition to the communist regime. This led to a third major wave of immigration to America. And again, this brought a more political element to the Polish American identity that it was there in the first wave, but not as much. It tended to be more cultural in the first wave, and we'll get into a little bit of that. Now, one of the major institutions that came with the Polish American immigrants, and we kind of saw a little bit with my grandfather's commemorative plaque, was the fact they brought over their faith and with it kind of elements of Catholic culture. And of course, they really distinctly wanted their own, distinctly Polish style churches. And to this day, in America, in the Midwest especially, they're called Polish cathedral style churches because they were modeled after cathedrals that were built in Poland. And it's kind of interesting because they also did a form of what we would call today crowdfunding to try to fund the construction of these churches. They even took out loans and mortgages on their homes despite whatever lack of resources they would have individually, but they wanted to really fund the building of these grand churches. And they wanted this to be a reminder to their descendants, like, hey, yes, you are in America, you are American, but we want you to always remember your roots, where you came from. Yes, you're in America, but your story didn't start in America. It started in Poland, and we want you to remember and to carry that on in America. And as a result, a lot of areas of Polish American life did center around the church. They served social and cultural aspects as well. Also, because of the lack of education for a lot of these early Polish immigrants, the priest would have been the most educated person. So, aside from religious matters, they would have also gone to him for, all sorts of different financial, legal, and other important matters. So, he played a very key role in the Polish community. So much so, it even led to a schism in among some Polish parishes in the sense that they crowdfunded these churches and they said, well, we should control how they go, how they operate. But a lot of bishops said, no, they're under our control. They're Catholic churches. So they broke away. So a few parishes did break away and they formed what is still known today as the Polish National Catholic Church. It's about 30,000 strong, and it still centers around a lot of Polish Americans. But yeah, but most Polish Catholics stayed loyal to the Pope and remained Catholic. And these are images that a friend sent me, but it's a commemorative pillow for a Polish American's first mass celebrated in the Detroit area in 1939. So it's a pillow. We have a picture here on the left of the priest, and then on the right we have a picture of the pillow. It's in Polish and very beautiful. And again, like I said, a lot of heirlooms, especially from this era, for Polish Americans, they're going to have a religious element because, like I said, the church played a very key role in their day-to-day lives. But of course, alongside the church, there were also other fraternal organizations that tried to band together, both the Polish American community, and then later on also try to maintain contacts with Poland after Polish independence. We'll get into that in a minute. But yeah, some of these organizations still exist to this day. There's the Polish Roman Catholic Union of America, the Polish Falcons, which I believe is kind of a bit of a more of a athletic society, make sure Polish youth are healthy and strong. So if need be, they can fight for their country, both either America or Poland, the Polish National Alliance. And then later on, there was the Polish American Congress. And the picture here is one I took from the Polish National Aid Society in Grand Rapids. It's another city here in Michigan, a little bit halfway between Detroit and Chicago. But I was able to visit their headquarters about a year or so ago. And again, you see the Polish flag and the Polish eagle. And this is one of the longest continuous social clubs in not only among Polish Americans, but also one of the oldest continuous social clubs even in America. And of course, another staple of Polish culture that got brought over and a lot of Polish Americans can relate to is Polish food. And to this day, and you saw that a little bit in the Hamtramck mural, but yeah, you see a lot of Polish grocery stores. In fact, just this past weekend, a new Polish market just opened up here in the Detroit area. I haven't visited yet, but I will. But yeah, there's bakeries and everything, and it's just such an important staple of the Polish American experience. And this is a picture I just took at one of the random stores here in the Detroit area, but just shows you can get Polish style food. Now, Dudek is a local brand. It's a local Polish American brand of Polish food that you can get, which just kind of shows, this transmission of culture. Another famous form of Polish food are punchki. And it's kind of like a pastry. I do have a picture on the far right of what they look like. They're I hate to say this, but yeah, they're almost akin to like jelly donuts. Bear with me. That's kind of like one way you can think of them. Of course, they're not jelly donuts, but just to give people a basic idea of what it's like. But it's a filled pastry, and it's very prominent, especially around the time of Lent. Now, in Poland, they do what is called Fat Thursday, the Thursday before the beginning of Lent. Here in the Polish diaspora, we do Fat Tuesday. So, literally the day before Ash Wednesday is when we do it. And I suspect part of that is because of the Mardi Gras French influence in America. So it's kind of interesting that you do see this variation, but yet the same traditions. And of course, the other picture is from one of the Polish restaurants here, Mr. Punchek, Mr. Punchek, dressed up in the costume. And they also here in the Detroit area, they also do like a 5K run for Punchki Day, where you run 5K and then at the end you can just pig out on you can eat as many punchkis as you want because you already burned off the calories. But it's kind of like a charity event and a community event. So again, another example of this transmission, but also modification of traditions across time and space from what we see here in America versus what you might see in Poland. Now, one key element or one key event in Polish and Polish American history was World War I, and out of that came Poland's independence. Now, for those Polish Americans who were formal citizens, they did serve in the U.S. Army, but there was also Polish Americans who fought in the Polish Army, most specifically Joseph Haller's Blue Army that fought for Polish independence. And these pictures here are actually from a monument in Grand Rapids, same one where the Polish National Aid Society is, but it's a monument to the men of Grand Rapids area that fought in Haller's Blue Army, and they're buried at that cemetery where this monument is. But again, it just kind of shows a little bit of this transmission and connection between the diaspora and the old country, Poland in this case. And this continued into World War II. Of course, World War II began with the invasion of Poland. And in the Detroit area, I know exactly that when that happened, large numbers of Polish Americans tried to flood the Polish consulate to try to volunteer for the Polish army. But of course, because of the rapid success of the German army, they weren't able to really do anything. But nevertheless, the Polish army or the Polish government in exile did try to drum up support from the diaspora for their efforts to continue the fight. And that even included visiting Detroit. I have seen the archival footage of General Sikorsky's visit to Detroit, I believe in 1941, if I remember correctly. Not only that, but a lot of the Polish American organizations and media also tried to drum up support. And this even includes some of the radio programs, the Polish American radio programs. They would even try to transmit messages into Poland, kind of giving them messages of hope, just letting them know, hey, you were not forgotten. We're doing everything we could to try to help the war effort, either working in the factory, serving in the army, whether in the U.S. Army or even the Polish free forces. And yeah, speaking of Polish Americans who served in the army, the picture here is Sergeant Frank Shaborski, who was a Polish American from the Detroit area, and he's enjoying his Thanksgiving turkey while serving in Italy in 1944. And it's kind of interesting that also nearby would have been the Polish Second Corps that would have fought at Monte Cassino. And this, of course, is from my grandfather, the same grandfather who I showed the commemorative plaque earlier for his first communion, but we also have a plaque of his wartime service in the U.S. Army, in the Pacific Theater, New Guinea, and the Philippines. Now, unfortunately, due to a fire in the 1970s, his official records were destroyed, but at least with this plaque, we can at least know what unit he served in, and from there we can kind of infer what he did during the war. Now we get to a little bit of a period of Polish American history that's a little bit that sometimes people in Poland misunderstand. Because I heard one comment while in Warsaw that, oh, that Polish Americans are just Americans with Polish names, or they have like a very shallow understanding of what it means to be Polish or a Polish identity. And I can understand where they get that impression, but I would also say it's also not very fair given the circumstances because Polish Americans from the time that they came to America, they they faced this stereotype that they weren't truly American enough. And we were joking earlier about the names and pronunciations, but that was one factor that contributed to that. And like I said, I mean, I decades later, even I have to deal with people who don't know how to pronounce my name. Now, I don't think it's necessary. A lot of people, it's not necessarily like maliciously intended, but there were times where, especially growing up, it would be maliciously intended, and that's why a lot of Polish people would later try to Americanize their names or prefer the American pronunciation of their names, just to try to at least try to fit in. And there was also the perception that they were Catholic, so they were more loyal to the Pope than to the US. And this didn't really go away until the election of John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s. But also with the Cold War context, now that the Russians and or the Soviets and the communists started to take over in Poland, there was this perception that maybe Polish Americans they might be more loyal to the communist regime in Poland, or they might be spies or even maybe cover for spies from the Soviet bloc. And given the Cold War context, there's reasons for that, and there is an element of truth to it. A lot of East European immigrants were key constituents for the early American Communist Party in the 1920s and 30s. Having said that, most East European immigrants had nothing to do with that, but again, guilt by association. And during World War II, there was already this issue of, well, are the Germans, the Italians, and most famously the Japanese, are they going to be a problem? And they were dealt with during World War II. So now it's now this issue in the Cold War context just a few years later. So out of this context, a lot of Polish Americans were pressured to kind of just de-emphasize their heritage, and that included, like for example, abandoning the Polish language, and I just mentioned about changing their names or the pronunciation of their names. But I would also like to say that doesn't mean they didn't care or they were indifferent to their heritage. It was more about like, well, what could we keep? What could we do to maintain at least some element of our identity without having to give it all up? And again, going back to the Cold War context, even if you did try to maintain contact in Poland, that would have been a good way to get yourself on a watch list, both with the FBI here in America, but also your relatives back in Poland with the secret police or the KGB. That actually happened to some of my Ukrainian relatives. They would write back and forth in the 1950s and 60s, and the mail would always come already opened. And we kind of always wondered, was it the FBI or the KGB that was reading it? And knowing what I know about Cold War era intelligence operations, I think it was both. But again, they were just writing about like, oh, this is how the kids are, this is how the grandkids are. Oh, I see you got this, you got that. But again, that would be enough to get you on a watch list, or possibly worse, if you send it over to your relatives in Poland, well, they're communicating with the West, so now they're taken out and sent over to Siberia. So again, so in some ways, a lot of communications between Poland and the diaspora, ceased, and we had to make the best of the bad situation at the time. This didn't really change until the election of Karl Wojtyła as Pope John Paul II in 1978, and then finally, for the first time, it became more respectable to be Polish American on in the American society. And of course, John Paul II was also very vocal in his support for Poland's struggle for freedom, and this galvanized a lot of Polish Americans to help aid their relatives back home or their cousins back home. So I mentioned how there was this possible stereotype of Polish Americans being spies, but this kind of comes back, but it's interesting. It's not necessarily they're spies for the communists. They're potential spies for the American government, and the American government tried to foster some of these relationships between the diaspora and Poland to try to get material and assistance to the opposition to the communists. So it's kind of interesting how, again, how different circumstances, different contexts can have the perceptions slightly changed, even if it's basically the same thing. And I mentioned earlier that John Paul II was actually able to visit the Detroit area in 1987, and of course, he really galvanized the Polish community, and he spoke to them. And this was one excerpt from his speech to the Polish community that I really find very interesting and would be very interesting to explore a very civilizational perspective on this question of diasporas. And essentially, he's like saying, "Dear brothers and sisters, the more you are aware of your identity, your spirituality, your history, and the Christian culture out of which your ancestors and parents grew, and you yourselves have grown, the more you will be able to serve your country, the more capable you will be of contributing to the common good of the United States." And that kind of gets back to points that we've gotten here, is that Polish Americans have never been about like, oh, are you Polish or are you American? It's more about how can you really genuinely contribute to both. So even our devotion to our heritage is more about enriching our devotion to America. And that whole era where in some ways we were kind of our heritage was pitted against our devotion to our country. It even to this day, it's still kind of like a real sensitive question for Polish Americans, like in a sense of like, well, please don't make us choose because in some ways, if you do, if we have to choose between one, the other one's gonna die too. So in some ways, if we neglect our Polish heritage in favor of our Americanism, eventually our Americanism is gonna suffer too. But of course, if we choose the Polish over the American, in some ways, because the Polish culture we grew up was a little bit different, so it just kind of creates more of a mess than if you get my drift. So, of course, where are we at today? Many challenges remain, but Polonia has proven rather resilient in it. The legacy of that one era where we were forced to de-emphasize our heritage still remains, but we are also trying to do what we can to recover as much ground. Like, for example, many Polish Americans were trying to learn Polish, or at least learn as much as we can. Even if we can't be fluent, it's still important for us to learn some of it. The Polish American identity culture is actually multi-layered. I've just given you a very brief overview there. I mean, we could talk about this for days on end about this. But again, that comment I heard in Warsaw of us being Americans with just Polish names, again, of course, the names they do carry weight. Colleague of mine gave me that who's in the audience. Uh, but also but again, we don't want it to just be seen as just purely shallow or anything like that. If it does seem shallow to people in Poland, understand it was just us trying to adapt to a very difficult situation. It's more accurate to see Polish American identity as a versatile blend of Polish and American elements, and in one way, one has enriched the other. And of course, Polish people can accept us as the American branch of a wider Polish family, despite whatever differences we might have, and there will be differences. There always will be. But take it as pride that Poland has had a wider impact on the world, and the fact that Polish culture is found almost in many different parts of the world or some variation of it. Now we get to the civilizational implications of the study of Polonia. And I've often have said, and I got a sense of this while in Warsaw, that being Polish is now a global identity as much as a national identity. Yes, for Polish people, it will always be their national identity, no doubt about it. But for us in the diaspora in Polonia, there is going to be a global dimension to it. And also, there's this sense that we're in a very globalized, interconnected world. Certainly, we're under strain. It's under strain quite a bit due to recent events. But there is this sense that yes, we can be deeply interconnected, but we can also be deeply connected to our roots. It's not one or the other. It's more about how does one relate to the other in some ways. And this can be a very complex and very rich question, even both theoretically, but also in terms of anthropological and sociological and theoretical investigation. And being Polish American also kind of means being like a bridge between the old and the new worlds. Many people on both sides of the Atlantic usually want to try to pit like Europe and America as mutually exclusive and so forth. And of course, there's going to be disagreements between Europe and America in terms of politics and geopolitics. And that's not what I mean here. I'm kind of meaning from a deeper historical and cultural roots that no, they actually can be connected. They can be and have been deeply connected. And just finally, I mean, I think the Polish American story has a lot to teach us about how the dynamics of identities, cultures, and so forth. It kind of has a deeply human story about how these dynamics work across different times and space. And then you can also compare this to other examples, not only different diasporas, but even like going back to like the ancient world, like how Greek culture spread throughout much of the Near East. And then we have examples like the Indo-Greek kingdoms in what is now India. And then you have Greek culture interacting with the rising religion of Buddhism and how that kind of created its own dynamic. So it's kind of interesting that this has been a very common dynamic that we see throughout history and in the history of cultures and civilizations. And I think the Polish American story has much to contribute to that conversation. And that's kind of the main basis of my talk. And I really am interested in any comments or discussions. There's a lot more I can say about this, but of course, again, I could be talking all day about this.
Ah, thank you, Stephen. Fascinating. Actually, I could listen to you. You could continue. Um,
If I could say one point, I know S.N. Eisenstadt, who was a major figure in the civilizational field, in his book on multiple modernities, he did have a study on. There's a chapter about the Indian diaspora or the Hindu diaspora, and there were three main components or elements of how they kind of relate themselves to their identity. There's the diaspora uh, identity where it's kind of like Indian American. In this case, it would be like you're purely Polish American. You don't really have much, you don't have anything against Poland, but your main focus is on Polish people in America. There's the transnational identity, which is about how, again, in this case, how Polish Americans relate to Poland. But then there's also the transnationism, which is essentially like what is like the core element of the Polish identity and how can Polish communities around the world can kind of maintain that core and still be able to communicate and relate to one another, even despite the variations. Again, the original context was India and the Hindu diaspora, but I think it'd be very interesting that this could be applied to the Polish case, and it would be very interesting to try to investigate that.
I appreciate you saying that, Stephen, because myself, given I spent every single summer of my life in Poland, I speak and write it. I've translated from Polish to English my grandma's memoir. Went to Polish school. I worked there. I studied there. I have my dual citizenship. In the process of getting my daughter hers. And I'm studying that region of the world, right?
Mhm.
It's fascinating to me how the term Polishness is very different. Like when you're there and with the history, for our entire history and the entire history of Poland and the lands up until 1945 was a mosaic. It wasn't just Catholic. It was Christian Orthodox. It was Greek Catholic. It was Jewish, Muslim, and many different languages: Yiddish, Belarusian, certain dialects. Right? There's the Highlander. There's the what they call Gwara in Silesia, and on the coast, Ukrainian. Um, and then each city and each region having like their own dialect as well. But there's this core unison of the land and the traditions that superseded any of those labels. But when people migrated from there, it's as if religion immediately separated them. So for me, it's a fascinating concept of, well, what if we didn't bring religion into the mix and just people who came from those lands? And for me, I would love to see then what really the impact of being Polish has been. And because I myself have Jewish roots, I have Christian Orthodox roots, and Catholic ones. I literally three within my lineage. So then, where does the question like, am I less Polish American because of that? No, I'm not. But it's fascinating to me how once we migrated, how all it's like whoop, those became separators. And I think our impact is way bigger, which is exciting. And I think that is something worthy to celebrate. But it's something that
Yes.
still like a topic that people are trying to unearth because we weren't really allowed to talk about it for so long. Um, so that's just something that's just like very, I appreciate you bringing that up and just, I think we have been more badasses than we even give ourselves credit for.
Yes, and it's a good thing that you mentioned that mosaic in Poland, because actually that got recreated in many ways here in America. Now, I did focus on the Catholics just because I had, like I said, I had to kind of condense a lot of it because there's a lot I could talk about, even like with the
Mhm.
Jewish, and the Orthodox and Greek Catholic, because even with the Greek Catholic, there was the distinction, well, are you Polish or are you Ukrainian? There was that question. But one thing when I was at the Polin Museum during the conference, which is about Polish or Jewish history in Poland, but they were kind of talking about like that mosaic, and it kind of reminded me, like, we almost had a version of that, not just with the Polish, but I mean, you have like even just in the Detroit area, right next to the Polish neighborhoods, you'd have the Lithuanians, the Slovaks, the Romanians, and everything. So it's almost like a microcosm of Central and Eastern Europe. They all came here for to work in the automobile industry. But yeah, and that again adds a whole new civilization, what we would call civilizational dynamic, where in some ways it's kind of like, yeah, you have your distinct Polish or ethnic identity, but yet they also blur at the same time in the sense that it's not like mutually exclusive in the sense that, in a purely nationalistic sense. Because even like when I encounter, like, for example, the Slovaks, I see that they do kovasa instead of kielbasa. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I understand what that means, and it's kind of like, oh, okay. I mean, they're kind of like our Slavic cousins, so to speak. And there is more of that sense here in the New World, and also just how also the different dialects and the regional and local traditions in Poland, they came in and then they kind of intermixed, and then out of that came like the different distinct Polish
Mhm.
American identities. So it's almost like it is like a very distinctly American twist, but it is kind of in continuity with that mosaic thing. But yeah, thank you. That was a very good point, and I did not mean to reduce that mosaic. I just had to concentrate on some core elements here. Otherwise, again, I could be talking for 20
I
hours.
mean, I had to make that distinction in my book as
Oh yeah.
well. I had to because my grandma, when writing about her history, it came from a Polish Roman Catholic viewpoint. So I had to make a distinction too. But it's just fascinating to me that it's like downright unconscious that we do this. And then it's like, wait a second, why are we doing this? But it's like, it's part of it's just explaining it to other people. Poland it's really difficult because it's complicated for us. It's super complicated for us. So to explain it to someone else, so it's like kind of in many ways it simplifies it to try to explain it by putting it in these boxes. But like I'll give you an example. I was over the weekend, I got invited to a local Ukrainian diaspora group meetup, and because they're launching an editorial, they asked me to contribute to it, which I did. And they were making there was one of my friends is Jewish. There's me, and then there's Ukrainians. There, Ukrainians call the placki ziemniaczane, which are potato pancakes, what we call in
Oh yeah.
Polish, right?
Yeah.
And the Ukrainians, oh my God, forgive me, I forget what it is in Ukrainian. Borune, I think they're called in Ukrainian. And then my Jewish friend was like, "These are latkes," and like one of my friends asked, like, "Well, what's the difference?" We're like, "It's the same thing." We're
Yeah.
like, "It's literally the same
I have an exact
thing."
story of that. I have an exact story because my family, when we did pierogi, we did what are called Russian pierogies.
Ah, yeah, piroshki or no,
Yeah, pierogi.
pelmeni,
Yeah,
pelmeni, pelmeni.
yeah.
That's what it's called. Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
my Russian teacher, because one time I took him into my Russian teacher, who's actually was Ukrainian, but she called them loshki. She's like, "Oh, these are
Mm,
so good. These are so good." But it was kind of interesting. It's like the same thing, but then each person has their own unique twist to it. And it gets into that issue of like, well, the diaspora, we have our twist to it, and then the people in Poland and also Eastern Europe, Central Europe, generally speaking, they got their perspective. And it's not so much like one is right, one is wrong. It's like, no, no, no. It's like a different angle on the same thing. And it's more about like one reason why I'm trying to do like these talks and all that is more about, well, let's try to just at least bring it together and just see like, no, 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 we're actually kind of talking about the same thing, but so forth. And I think the civilizational, sorry if I'm bringing it back to that, but from our forum name, but we try to think of that way, and we think that that might move us beyond the mere nation-centric perspective. Not that national identities or nations are wrong or anything, but it's just the problem. You tend to be a little limited if that's the extent of your perspective. Whereas civilization, it's kind of like a wider framework, but one that still kind of respects the integrity of these
Yeah.
local and different types of parochial identities. So, yeah, if you got any thoughts on that, or if anybody else has thoughts, please, by all means.
Yeah, I lately have been really reflecting a lot on this. Like, what is it? What is like the Polishness? And for me, what really calls forth is the land. So, like the types of plants, and then the herbs, and the climate, and how the climate affects the cooking, and then the way buildings were built, right? And gestures that kind of go across any sort of labels, right? Like even with hands, like going like, there's just so many hand gestures, and just like the textiles and more like cultural, um anthropological elements to it, which are just really deeply connected to the land. So that's something I've been really looking into as of late. There is this return, it seems like, for a lot of people in Poland today, going into the kind of pre-Christian times of like, well, who were we as Slavic, like Polonia tribes? What was that? And a lot of it is interwoven with the food and the textiles and words that have been adopted into certain dialects and languages. But once again, yeah, that's kind of too much. That makes people's heads explode when you leave Poland when you say something like that. So to try
Yeah,
to
yeah.
contextualize,
Although you're kind of bringing it up in the most appropriate place possible,
yeah,
because
yeah, I know,
we
but
we
just for
love
saying
we
that
love these types of
diaspora,
discuss. Yeah,
yeah,
you can ask BB. We love these types of discussions, and we love these different perspectives. And that again, that brings up a very good point. And also, it kind of reminds me. There was this one map I saw where it compared climates of North America to Europe, and where I'm at, it was literally the only place that was, and it was exactly like Ukraine. They said, and I said, well, that makes sense why all the Slavs came here. And even in the northern parts of Michigan, almost 70% of the population is Polish derived. And they went up there to work in logging, and they helped contribute to the lumberjack archetype in America because that intermixed with the Finnish elements. And many of those towns, I've been told, they even still speak Polish, albeit it's a 19th century version of Polish. So again, it's kind of just interesting how the culture, the traditions and the heritages, they can get transmitted, even halfway across the globe. You still see continuities, but then you also see these modifications. Like I just said, the one very simple example of Twinkie Day from Fat Thursday to Fat Tuesday, because that makes more sense in the American context with Mardi Gras, but again, it's still kind of the same thing. I've even seen stories about Fat Thursday where people are like lined up the street to go to the bakeries, and that's exactly how it is here, except it's on Fat Tuesday rather than Fat Thursday. So again, it's just very, very interesting, this dynamic. And I thought, and again, even getting to some of the points you put in, I think that just adds to why the Polish American story, or even Poland, because Poland has contributed very much so to the civilizational field. One of the founders of comparative civilizational sciences, Felix Konieczny, Polish. One of our former presidents, Andrew Tarkowski, Polish. Our current vice president, who couldn't join us, Greg Lewicki, Polish. Myself, Polish American. And then we also have another board member, Dr. Robert Badecki, Polish American. So it's kind of interesting that even in the diaspora, this civilizational aspect. I believe someone just. Okay, so someone wrote in the chat a question about does the Polish American identity or Polonia has had a less frictional relationship with the American political imagination? Yes and no. Just to make this long story short, there are Polish Americans who love Trump. There are Polish Americans who despise Trump. So in some ways, some of the divisions that you see wider in American society, they get reflected in many parts of Polonia as well. So even if we can have the same common cultural frameworks, it's so forth. I've also noticed this a little bit in the relationship to Polish politics. Now, I notice Polonia will tend to be more in favor of some of the conservative parties in Poland, but there have been some I've seen who are in favor of like Donald Tusk, who's more of a liberal in Poland, as far as I can tell. But also sometimes the lens through which Polish Americans are able to discern the politics in Poland is also sometimes through the lens that's provided by American media. This is does this kind of answer the question, or do you want me to try to explain more? Yeah, politics adds a whole new that's a whole topic in of itself of how the diaspora both is kind of how it relates to American politics. I do know during the last US presidential election, the Polish American vote actually came center stage because I know Trump was asserting he had the support of Polish Americans. Harris was trying to, try to gain support, and I believe it was the New York Times even kind of said how key the Polish American vote was in US presidential elections. And I think that was the first time Polonia had ever gotten that type of attention in American politics. So, yeah, it's an interesting time. That can be both good and bad, depending on your perspective.
I have two questions. Um, uh, is there a, is there a number of Polish Americans? Um,
Oh, yeah. You
when,
mean like total?
yes.
Okay, about around 8 to 9 million. I gave that at the beginning of the presentation, and we represent about 3% of the US population
Okay.
altogether.
And the second is regarding the waves. I'm sort of very interested in the waves because I also observe also in Europe how as also immigration is a big topic. And then, for example, if you look back, there's always, you have the first generation, even within the second, the third, and they show different behaviors. So if you would compare for the first generation and let's say and the second and third, which you said are pretty similar, they are more political, like while the first has more of a cultural I came for economic reasons, but also
Yeah,
has
the
more of
first wave.
carried more this cultural identity. Now their children, grandchildren, is there a difference between them?
Yes and no. It does depend. Now, I'm personally third generation Polish American. Now, stereotypically, the first generations, they kind of want to try to assimilate to America as soon as possible. The second wave kind of carries that forth. The third generation, either they continue it forward or they also get more of a sense of like, well, what can be lost if you don't take that seriously? Because the first and second generation, they kind of grow up with it, and so in some ways they could take it for granted a little bit. The third generation, there's then this key choice like, well, if you continue, if you don't continue it, if you don't do that, you're going to lose it, and if you lose it, it's gone, it's so forth. That kind of happened in my situation, and you just become more aware of it. And one thing I do notice is also in terms of the different waves, for example, and I'll do this with the third wave because a lot of those they came in the 1980s. Now a lot of their children are growing up. They want to continue. They're growing up in a different circumstance where it's more respectable to be Polish American, and they want to continue that. So when they meet people like me who's third generation, they're kind of like, oh, okay, we're on the same page, whatever differences we have. Whereas maybe their parent, because in the 1980s and 90s, there was a little bit of an issue where sometimes some of the more recent Polish immigrants have were more hostile to some of the descendants of the first wave and so forth. There was Miłosz who did that very famously in the late 1980s. He was a Polish writer and so forth. And yeah, I'm kind of noticing now the, the the distinctions are still there, but it's becoming more blurred. In more ways, we're kind of, especially in the Detroit area, we're kind of seeing ourselves as more, well, we're kind of on the same page. We're kind of trying to do the same thing. So even if I speak Polish with an American accent, usually people are like, "Oh, are you Polish?" And I say, "Well, I came from a Polish family," and they're like, "Oh, well." I even have a funny story. At one of the Polish restaurants here, tried to speak Polish, and she's like, "Oh, she got my waitress got all excited," but then I had to apologize. I said, "Well, I don't speak that much," and she says, "Oh, that's okay. Come back when you learn more. We'll talk more in Polish." So, and then Isa, you made a comment.
I was just responding to Anurag.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's kind of like a complex topic. And also in regards to the war effort in Ukraine, yeah, a lot of Polish Americans have been very supportive, and the Ukrainian Americans, for obvious reasons, have also been very, very supportive. And yeah, and especially since a lot of the Ukrainians in the Detroit area are Ukrainian Catholics, the line between them and the Polish was very blurred. That even happened in my family. My grandfather, same one who you saw, he married my grandmother who was Ukrainian Catholic. So there was like Ukrainian and Polish, and then there was even a Russian element in my family too, because my grandmother or my great grandfather, who was Ukrainian, he died in a mining accident in Pennsylvania, which was where a lot of the early Ukrainian immigrants migrated to. But then my great grandmother married into a Russian family from Kiev. And yeah, so there was kind of like this mix of Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian. And then also my great grandfather was from Lithuania, what is now Lithuania. So obviously there was, of course, that intermixing. So it's kind of interesting, and I think that's probably one reason why we did Russian pierogies rather than the standard Polish pierogies, because I noticed the difference there, and there, yeah, and I'm biased towards Russian pierogies because that's what I grew up with. So
Ah, well, we even say in Polish, we say pierogi ruskie.
yeah, pierogi ruskie.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
and then one time years ago, one woman I knew from Warsaw, she actually made pierogi ruskie, and they tasted just exactly like what my grandmother used to make. And I was like, yes, these are pierogi, real pierogi like I used to have. And even my first night in at the Warsaw conference, I saw the food, and I just was drawn back to my and I even said this to Greg, our vice president. I said, this reminds me so much of Christmas Eve at my grandmother's, because we would always that was always the most Polish night of the year for my family. We didn't call it Vigilia. That's what most Polish people call it, but it was always the most Polish night of the year. And I think that's also kind of another interesting way of when you're diaspora and then you go to Poland and then everything just kind of reminds you so much of your own background, even though you've never been to this country before. But so much of it is so recognizable at the same time. And again, if you take that into more of a civilizational context, that makes sense. Whereas from a purely like national perspective, like, well, no, you're American. And it's like, well, yeah, but I grew up in a Polish community, Polish family, and so forth. And I mean, yeah, my grandfather fought in the US Army. I mean, we're not like denying any of that, but it's like at the same time, there was that Polish influence, or if you want to be Slavic, East European influence, getting back to, Ukrainian and Russian elements being in the intermix. So yeah, and again, that kind of gets into how that mosaic from Europe was transplanted here in America. You also see this with Polish and how they related to the Italians. Even the Italians will do punchki here in Detroit, but they'll do it like with cannoli cream and all that. So they'll put like an Italian twist to Polish pastries, which again, it's just kind of interesting how that can happen in a diaspora context. And and it really adds to the discussion of how these cultures, these identities, uh, they get transplanted. And I think this is a key element that the civilizational field can contribute to some of the discourse that we're seeing nowadays about our globalized world.
What, in your opinion, I like very much the quote you gave of Pope John Paul II. What would your message be, main, like, from a civilizational perspective?
Oh, for civilizational scholars, a bit? Well, I think it's just essentially civilizations are very multifaceted. And I think sometimes we try to reduce it to one element, like, oh, is it the political or world systems perspectives? Don't get me wrong, those are all good. But it's very multifaceted. And also, another point I have often made is when we think civilization, we often think of like the pyramids or the Colosseum or something like that. And those are important, don't get me wrong. But civilization is something that happens all around us. Even in my neighborhood here, I just explained how civilizational dynamics happen here, where we have these Polish and other traditions intermixing, and it kind of recreates both from the old world, but also in some ways recreating it anew. It's like a whole new dynamic twist to it, and I think it's just kind of interesting that we don't necessarily need to just focus that civilization, we don't necessarily have to just focus on some key elements. There's all sorts of different aspects. I even, BB, for example, if you remember, I mentioned that about your research on music and how that is such an important way that, sorry, my alarm just went off. Uh, how music is such an important way that cultures express themselves. But yet, for example, you could take Polish folk music, but then you could compare it to, like, say, Italian or Irish folk music. You obviously see differences, but then you could also see a lot of commonalities too at the same time, and that's a legitimate area for civilizational studies. And I think it's just very encompassing and just multifaceted. And I think hopefully I've only scratched the surface, but hopefully my presentation and also the discussion we've had has also just helped bring that to bear. And it's also, we don't just necessarily have to look at the ancient world. It's key, and not to say that we shouldn't. I mean, we should, but it also continues to the present day.
That we always have a discussion at conferences, but also between scholars, is the eternal question: what is a civilization? So I won't dwell into that to give any interpretation myself. However, what you are describing, as you said, in your area, could we say it could be a little micro civilization?
Yes, you probably
Um,
could say that. You could say that, and I could even talk about because you're from the Balkans, and there's even like Croatian and Serbian and Bulgarians in my area, Macedonians. Yeah, there's the Polish and the Slovaks, and then just down the street are the Macedonians. So it's so it's just kind of interesting. You get these microchisms, and that's another thing. Civilizations can be studied from different levels: the micro, the intermediate, and the macro. We usually like to focus on the macro for obvious reasons, but I think, hey, even like that, my the mural I showed you, and then also my commemorative plaque, it encapsulates like all these different levels when you think about it all together. And I think it's just kind of interesting that we have the tools to kind of investigate this from that perspective. So
because in a way, when you were both discussing on food and how it's called in different, you're basically creating a new, well, I can't say new civilization, but perhaps it could be, as I said, a micro, because you're in a way creating something new out of, well, out of the old, or out of a mix of uh, well, the heritages from Europe in this case.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's almost like it maintains their integrity, but also at the same time, it gets modified and changed in the process. So, and again, we see this throughout history in so many different contexts. Even if you remember from the Polin Museum,
Mm.
how they were talking about that with how different generations of Polish Jews were trying to relate to their heritage, to their culture, and their faith. It's the same thing that we are doing here in the diaspora. And it's also something that even Poland is doing as we speak. And that's also like, what is Poland's place in the world, in Europe, and so forth? And that's a question we very much can relate to in many ways as well in the diaspora, because we had to ask that question as well. And each generation has its own distinctive answer. It's not that we cancel out the previous generations, it's just we build on top of it. And in the same case, we both preserve but also modify at the same time. And they're not mutually exclusive.
They're like interlocked, living, breathing systems of like just energies that just keep interacting together. And yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, speaking upon, like, for example, we're talking about ponchki, right? And you're
Hmm.
talking about the Italians took them, but they modified them with the cannoli filling versus like we traditionally have it with the rose jam. Um, and like it's called sufa goniyot in Hebrew for Hanukkah. They have it as, and they'll go, yeah, this is Jewish food, and I'll look at them. I'm like, it's Polish. Like, Ponchki is straight up Polish, but like they serve it for Hanukkah. So it's like who, you know? So it's like who? What makes it like? What makes it change the label? That's what's fascinating to me, and that's the interlocking, overlapping webs of these identities and labels, but it all roots in the same land. Which is why for
Hmm.
me, the land that really is like that's where the answers arise. But yeah, these like they're like these complex systems just overlaying on top of each other.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned energy, because even the former president of CCF, it was still called ICSC at the time, but he was Lithuanian, and Vitalis Kalavos, I believe, if I remember correct. Yeah, Kalavos. But he talked about like the importance of energy to civilization. He talked about this, and of course, he was originally from Lithuania, but he also came to America, so he had that diaspora experience too, and that influenced his scholarship on the question, like how these mosaic of cultures interacted both in his native Lithuania and the Baltic region, but also how it came to be in America as well. And again, he devoted like an entire chapter of one of his books about how energy was very important to that. So yeah, you mentioning that just really reminded me of that. So, which again kind of gets into how all these different angles, all these different perspectives they feed into each other and everything, which is one thing I find very fascinating about the civilizational field and the civilizational perspective. It's not like, oh, it's your way or this
Mm.
paradigm or that way. And it's like, well, no, you have it this way. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. That kind of relates to this way of thinking. And rather than seeing them as mutually exclusive, it's more like, oh, how can they interlock? How can they relate to each other? So yeah, thank you. You brought up a new dimension of the civilizational field for us.
Mhm.
It's multi-layered, and that's
So much. It's
and there's
like an
more
onion.
connections.
Yeah, it's like an onion. It's like the
Mm.
each leaf, right? Or each, oh God, in Polish we call it the hairs of the onion. Like,
Uh,
that's what we call like, right? Each layer, there's just so many to them. And it's like, well, do you ever get to the core? It's just so much. And it's fascinating.
that's an interesting question. Do we ever? Because
Yeah,
again,
do we
like
ever get to the core? Right.
as BB mentioned, like what is a civilization? Do we ever get to the core of the question? And it's almost like, well, do you even want to get to the core? Because it's so interesting, all these different
Yeah.
layers of it. There's so many different ways you can think about it. And of course, if we take it from like Eastern Europe, but then we go to say East Asia, then it's like a whole, it's like onion, but also a whole another onion in and of itself. Even India, we have a few people here from India and who have asked questions. That's like its own onion layered of itself. So it's like a whole world onto itself. So it's again, it's just very, very interesting. And then how do they relate? How do they? India is a salad. Okay. Yes. Well. Yeah, some are onions, some are salads, some are melting pots, as they say.
Is
So,
anybody hungry?
darn, we should have brought
I love
we should
that
have brought
comment.
pierogies
I
for
love it.
yeah, we should have brought pierogi,
You know
kapusta.
what? That is actually such a good point because Eastern Europe, or at least the lands of Poland, a lot of our foods are in root vegetables. So a lot of carrots and
Mhm.
beets and parsnips, onions, shallots. Those are and that's what got us through the winters, right? Just having those root vegetables. So it's so funny that the Indian in the group says India is a salad because it's a different climate.
Yeah, different climate,
That
and then
just
of course,
shows like my ethnocentricity that I just displayed right there.
yeah, and then the Irish they had they had potatoes that they had
Yes,
to
yes, the
survive
potato.
on.
Can't forget about the potato. Can't forget
Yeah.
about the potato.
Yeah,
Okay.
but hey, that brings up a whole new dimension. Like, what are some of the metaphors we think of? Like,
Yeah.
even with food and all that. Like, why is it certain foods are more prominent in certain areas? Like, for example, I know among the nomadic, like the nomads of Eurasia, they based more of their diet on like meat and hunting, whereas like say in China, it was more like agricultural because of course on the steppes, there's not much you can grow in a large scale, so they had to do more hunting. So again, and that explains more of like how they lived, also even their form of warfare were the mobile forms, which is why the Mongols, for example, were able to conquer vast territories and all that. So again, there's just so many different dimensions that we can look at here. And again, India is where language and food changes every 200 kilometers. So which again kind of proves that India in itself is like a world unto itself. East Asia is a whole world unto itself. East Europe, Central and East Europe is a whole world on itself. And again, getting back to the point of micro civilization, I was kind of thinking of that because, yeah, it's connected to Western Europe, particularly in Poland. It's connected to Western Europe, but it was like very much on the edge of it. And it also had connections with the East.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it was almost like a whole dynamic of itself. And related to the civilizational state debates that we've been ongoing, of course, the Russians, they kind of go back to Muscovy, but then Muscovy was competing with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for control of the region. So it's almost like, is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth like another type of prototype of a civilizational state, which we see with the concept of the intermarium and also the three C's initiative today? Again, this gets into more geopolitics, but again, but that's another legitimate dimension. Another thing I've been kind of thinking about and bouncing ideas off with some of our Polish colleagues about, but it's also again like how history and culture interrelate and how, again, from the civilizational perspective, there's just so many different dimensions we could examine, even if we want to examine it like through food, like what impact did that have and why that is related to the climate and everything else and how so forth.
Yeah.
Anyway, who wants pierogi now?
I would not mind. I always have pickles in my fridge. Like that's one thing that makes me super Polish. Like people come to my fridge and I'm like, it's always stocked with pickles. Always. Like I just can't.
But
Always.
these are interesting regions, like of the world, where okay, our colleague wrote out language and food changes every 200 kilometers in India. But if coming to the Balkans, for example, so ranging, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Macedonia, where the influences have been from, the Habsburgs to the Ottomans, that within 50 kilometers. For example, around Dubrovnik, you had the Habsburgs, the Venetians, the Ottomans. There's a very famous Croatian author wrote a book about it, turned into a series later. And then you see how the dynamics of very different cultures, and but how they, you know, um, even traded, married, created their own microcosmos. And of
Yeah.
course, which influences are till today both positive and unfortunately negative too. But if you see our language, it's also there are German terms, there are Turkish terms. It's a mix. But interesting, my colleague, I was last year I took a sabbatical and became a student again, and a close colleague of mine was from Poland. And then I would always say to him, "Oh, in Croatia we have a saying." And he said, "But Bibi, we in Poland we also have this habit of we have a lot of sayings."
Hmm.
So,
Yeah,
Yeah.
talking about languages
yeah.
and
I've never been to the Balkans, but it's definitely on my bucket list. My dad's a travel photographer, and he's made many, 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 many trips. He actually just drove through, and he's in Greece right now, but he drove through all the Balkans. What's fascinating to me about the Balkans is for one, anyone who speaks any of the Balkan languages understand Polish people. We can't understand a word back. It's so
interesting.
weird. Yes, like
Okay.
all Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, Slovenian, like Montenegrin, they all understand what we say, and we're like, we do not. And it's like the separation is between whose is the Cyrillic alphabet, not Cyrillic alphabet, and whose religion. So
Mhm.
that's another like demarcation of the religion and the alphabet that is used there. But then y'all kind of more or less like speak, y'all can understand each other
Yes.
with the
I,
language.
mhm. Perhaps
So,
Slovenian is a bit different and Macedonian, but
uh-huh.
everybody in between can understand each other. Yes.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
that's fascinating to me.
Mm.
Yeah, and even in terms of sayings, there's one story I have because my
Mhm.
grandfather would always have a saying like, an empty can makes the most noise. But then I heard like I believe it was Polish, but it was a Slavic saying, I believe maybe Russian, that's like an empty pot makes the most noise. I was like, and it's almost like, yeah, it's almost like a variation of that, and that got translated over here. And so again, you see those continuities even if you see the modifications and changes. And yes, when I encounter people from the Balkans, because I've studied Russian, so when one of their greetings I know in the Balkans is stravo, correct, BB?
Yes.
Mhm.
But then
Yeah,
of
yeah.
course I know that from Russian with strasvice or strasvi, so it's like, okay, I can kind of understand that a little bit.
Together my Croatian and well, actually, I'm currently now in Prague. I actually live in Prague, and with my Czech, I I can understand more Polish. I can understand Slovenian, Slovak. So I widened my. I think I can understand more Slavic languages because they're interconnected. For
Oh, very much.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
much.
I learned Cyrillic to
Mhm.
read and write it. And when I read any Balkan language, I understand way more than what is being said.
Mhm.
And with Bulgarian and Ukrainian, Belarusian, Russian as well, it's the same thing. But yeah, once you learn to kind of dip into another group, it opens up the whole world. And you're like, oh, we actually have way more in common than we thought. Like,
Yeah, and I
yeah.
think that's one reason why that region produced so much of the civilizational field. Because I mean, even Petrom Sorokin, our first uh, president, he was from Russia, but he was from the Komi region, so he also dealt with like a lot of the Finnic peoples in the north. And yeah, and it just seems like you can see that, like where you have, yes, you have distinct cultures and identities, but at the same time those distinctions can be blurred depending on the context. It's not like mutually exclusive. And that's also why even Arnold Toynbee later said like the whole concept of nationalism that made more sense in Western Europe, but in
Mm.
Eastern Europe, you had like people this different mosaic, and it was almost like like one nation, one state. It's like it was very
Yeah.
much more complex.
We didn't conquer the new world either. We did not. We focused eastward. We didn't go on the ships and go to North America or South America or to Asia like Western Europe did. So why would, nationality would come in handy for conquest and subjugation and the new lands and new territories. Whereas for us, it was like, well, we already like speak so many common languages, have a lot of stuff together. Like, yeah, nation. That's why you could have a Yiddish speaking Jewish shtetl that claims allegiance to the Polish crown next to a Belarusian speaking like Christian Orthodox 10 kilometers away that have Catholic family members that claim allegiance to the Lithuanians. But it
Yeah.
was like that. But
Yeah,
because like
like
go and conquer, we didn't do that.
yes, and I think with kind of like the way that the world is moving, we're kind of moving more in that type of direction and less away from the West European model of the nation state, but it's more of like that mosaic model that existed in Eastern and Central Europe. So I think in some ways, when we're trying to navigate like how to like navigate that type of issues today, it may be more worthwhile to try to look at Central and Eastern Europe as the model rather than to Western Europe for that model. That's always been a thought of mine because it's almost like when I read or hear about it, like again, even at the Pauline Museum, it was like, well, gee, that's almost like a lot of like what the world was like, what the world is like today, or even like how it is, like I said, with the little micro civilization that the term BB just coined,
Yay!
that we see a lot. Yeah. No, honestly, you should seriously like,
Microcosm.
yep, yeah,
Microcosm.
microcosm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just, and again, it's kind of like, and even Isa, you brought up that one point about the Polish in Lithuania, how they have that sense of loss in one of our
Mhm.
private conversations. But it was like, yeah, well, my family came from Lithuania, and it's almost like, yes, we have that uh, a sense of loss, maybe not in the exact same sense or the exact same context, but yeah, that sense of like I said about being third generation, like the sense that you can lose your heritage if you don't try to preserve it or
Yeah.
take it seriously. And it's like, yeah, that sense of, loss. And in some ways, that kind of, I can understand, when you said that, I could easily understand it. I could relate to that, even if in a different context. And even like, as we said, like, even when BB was talking about the dynamics of the Balkans, it's like, oh, yeah, that's kind of like how what I see in my neighborhood, but also the history of Central and Eastern Europe. That's kind of interesting. And then even with India, when they were talking about, a different language and food every 200 kilometers. And it's almost like, well, in Europe, almost there's a new language every 200 kilometers as well. Not in the exact same sense, but, it's interesting those parallels. And in some ways, so. And it's kind of interesting how the civilizational field kind of delves into these issues, but it's also like, what also makes us human? It's kind of like, well, what does it even mean to be human? And I think in some ways these types of questions kind of speak to that, even though we have our own peculiar like heritages and all that. Because I know that was a criticism of Samuel Huntington or something. It's like, oh, you're promoting, racism or animosity between different civilizations and so forth. That's another issue, whether or not that's a fair
That's a
critic.
whole other thing. Yeah, I
That's a
had a
whole
long,
nother. That's a whole.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
I
a whole
mean,
nother topic.
yeah. I would say. I mean, I worked in HR at a global multinational company for 12 years and a couple more years in another multinational company in HR. And I will tell you this: understanding people's contexts, which involves understanding the history, understanding the culture, nuances with language, helped me tremendously in resolving conflicts, right? And also seeing people without those labels and seeing the human. So I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I mean,
Yeah.
just being able to honor the traditions wherever anyone comes from and us remembering where we come from as well, because like our lineages do hold a lot of pain, and just remembering though is a way of healing that. But it does involve knowing where our ancestors came from and what they experienced. So I think it's actually a requirement for us to evolve and see, and for humanity is to know where we come from.
That's an
Yeah.
excellent point.
Yeah, that was an excellent point. That was what I was about to say. Like, even though there's that common accusation a la Huntington, in many ways, the civilizational field is also about like it can be more about like, well, what does it even mean to be human, to have, a heritage, to have roots and all that. And then out of that, you can actually kind of understand each other more, or at least you can kind of better understand it. I'm not saying it'll eliminate all conflicts, but it at least gets you closer to that goal. But yeah, and I'm so glad that my talk and my presentation and my thoughts helped generate this very enriching discussion. I think we even went over our 30 minutes, but hey, I'm more game for continuing.
I mean, I am personally not um, uh, like I've just lived abroad all my life, since I was 5 months old. And what you said about knowing yourself, and knowing where you come from is very important, as well as understanding. I grew up and went to international schools, so my surroundings have been people from all from different countries, different religions, and hence my friends are. Uh, it's a it's a big pot of from all over the world. Um, so um, I I often think when we do discuss civilizations, how we do often forget the person, the human level. That's why I'm happy we were mentioning this, because there we achieve understanding, as you Isa said, is about who traditions, and the only thing we need is respect.
Yeah.
That's kind of, I think, the key word also for civilizations is, um, with respect we can gain a lot, but if
Yes.
we don't have respect, then we lose a lot. Like humans and humanity then loses.
Yeah. And this curiosity that comes with it.
Yes.
Wanting to, and this is why this is such a beautiful discussion, because like we are curious and we do want to know. We have these questions because it's interesting, and how can we dig into it even more, and what revelations can come to us as a result. Like this is that curiosity, which is just really necessary as well, and it's also fun.
Yes, it is fun, and just how, for
Fun.
example, my civilizational story helped sparked all these different
Yes,
thoughts and
exactly.
everything. So yeah, and it wasn't just me. Of course, the first part was just me talking, but I was like, no, please share your thoughts. I want to hear this. I want to hear the thoughts. That's why I also love CCF and I love our conferences, because this is so much like what we do both in person but also in events like this. So we just love the sharing our perspectives and everything like that. So and it's almost like we have a very unique place to do that, as opposed to some other possible fields. Like again, like with the nationalism based discourses. And again, I do research on nationalism and all that, so I'm not discounting like national identities. But again, it's also important to move beyond that when necessary too.
Well, as you said, it depends. As you said, Western Europe, for example, for them, the nation state has a meaning, while the area of Central Eastern Europe, the mosaic of people, they have a different perspective on
Mhm.
it. For example, what's now emerging in the news, um, and as an idea, is that the former Habsburg lands are more connecting. So that you see, for example, also in Austria, in here in the Czech Republic, um, like 3 years ago, I think during COVID, actually, a statue of Maria Theresia now is near the castle, for example. While so there's a sort of one could say a revival. There's even a TV series about her, but generally there was also I must think 2 years ago. The Czech Republic has, I don't know if the most castles per square meter in the world, but it has a lot of castles in any case. There was a year-long exhibition. There were year-long exhibitions on our Habsburg lands.
Wow.
So it's very sort of interesting that they're reconnecting, I think, more on a cultural level, but also that they have a shared history and we have a
Yeah.
shared background. You know, just the fact when I came first to study here in Prague, my my 2 years of I studied first in Zagreb, 2 years at the academy, and coming to Prague, uh, and this was some time ago, my studies in Zagreb were verified here in Prague based on Habsburg law. They are still valid. And I heard now recently another story similar, how somebody from Zagreb was going to Vienna and then found out that their certificates apply again due to the Habsburg connection, due to Habsburg times. So it's interesting now that you mentioned this mosaic of peoples, because what was the Habsburg monarchy? A mosaic of peoples lived.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's interesting now that there is a revival in for now in a cultural sense.
that's very interesting because even Otto von Habsburg, who was the last heir to the Habsburg throne, he was kind of one of the key figures in trying to get like the European to get together. And he was kind of like saying, well, something like akin to like the Habsburg Empire. He wasn't going to try to revive the empire, but he said, well, something akin to that would be the idea behind the European Union, where yes, you have your particular mosaic identities, but it was also you were connected in the wider sense,
Hmm.
that. So
That's
yeah,
and also like during the partitions era, the Austro Habsburg, the Hungar, I'm messing up the name, but the Habsburg portion,
Mhm, mhm,
the
mhm.
partition was known to be the the best out of all of the other partitions to be in because it had more tolerance and it had more freedoms and wasn't as oppressive either. And then a lot of like architectural gems arose from that era as well.
yeah. In fact, that's
So
even where John Paul II is from. His father was a officer in the Austro-Hungarian army. So
yeah. Okay. I'm so sorry, y'all, but my daughter has arrived home.
that's
So
fine. That is fine. We've had a very
I have
rich
to depart.
discussion.
Yes, but thank y'all so much. This was so good. I feel like I just got to nerd out in the best way. I love it.
Welcome to CCF.
Yes.
Yeah, I know so.
Thanks for joining, and I loved hearing your thoughts. Like,
Yes, thank you so
okay.
much. And have you'll have a good rest of your evening, BB,
Yes, thanks.
and even rest of your early evening.
I
Thank
was
you.
lucky. I was in the US. I came back on Sunday. So I told Stephen I'm lucky I'm still on US time a bit.
Yeah.
So it worked out. I'm not
A little late.
sleepy.
Yeah. But anyway, this was beautiful. This was great. Thank you so much. I got the my brain going here. So thanks,
Oh, I'm
y'all.
glad you could make it and
Thank
glad you
you.
enjoyed it.
Yeah. All right. Have a good one, y'all.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.